In a small, forgotten orphanage on the edge of town, young Ethan stared out the window, watching the rain pour down. He had lived there since he could remember, but every day felt the same, empty. His heart ached for a family he had never known. The other children played, but Ethan always kept to himself, afraid to hope for more. "Why do you always sit alone?" asked Mr. Thompson, the old janitor. Ethan shrugged, unsure how to explain the loneliness that gripped him. "You've got a lot more in you than you think, kid. Don't let this place define you," Mr. Thompson said with a kind smile, leaving Ethan to wonder what he meant. Those words lingered with him, sparking a small flame of hope. Ethan looked up to the janitor as a father figure. Mr. Thompson was the only one who noticed him. He often shared stories about life outside the orphanage, where people worked hard and made their own way. Ethan dreamed of that world, even if it felt a lifetime away. Nights were the hardest. Alone in his bunk, Ethan wondered if anyone would ever choose him. He listened to the other kids whispering about the families they wished for, and a deep sadness settled in his chest. He tried to stay strong, but the silence of the nights felt like they stretched forever. One day, as he swept the hallway with Mr. Thompson, Ethan asked, "Do you think I'll ever get out of here?" The old man paused, then replied, "The world is big, Ethan. You just have to find your place in it, but you have to believe you deserve it first." Those words stuck. Something in Ethan shifted that day. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to be invisible forever. He began to dream, though quietly, of a life beyond the orphanage. Yet every time he dreamed, reality reminded him where he was. He had no family, no home. But inside him, a seed of determination had been planted, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. The rain outside continued to fall, but for the first time, Ethan felt something different stir in his heart, a spark of hope. As the years passed, Ethan grew closer to Mr. Thompson, the only adult who seemed to care. The janitor wasn't much in the eyes of others, but to Ethan, he was a lifeline. Every day after school, Ethan would help him clean the orphanage, and in exchange, Mr. Thompson would tell him stories. Not just any stories, stories about surviving in a tough world. "You see, life ain't always fair, kid," Mr. Thompson would say, his voice gravelly from years of hard work. "But hard work, that's something no one can take from you." Ethan hung on every word, soaking up the wisdom like a sponge. One evening, as they scrubbed the floors together, Ethan asked, "Mr. Thompson, why do you still work here? You could be anywhere." The old man paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "This place may not be much, but it's where I learned what really matters. People, not money." Ethan nodded, but deep down, he dreamed of a life with more than cleaning floors, more than being invisible. Still, he couldn't deny that Mr. Thompson's words made him think. Maybe there was value in the quiet life, in doing the small things right. But life at the orphanage wasn't easy. The other boys teased Ethan for spending time with an old janitor instead of playing outside. "You'll end up just like him," they'd sneer. Ethan ignored them, focusing instead on what Mr. Thompson had taught him: hard work, perseverance, and a belief in something better. "One day, you'll leave this place," Mr. Thompson said one night as they locked up the orphanage. "But don't forget where you came from. It's part of who you are." Ethan nodded, but inside, he wasn't sure he wanted to remember. He wanted to leave the orphanage and never look back. Time moved on, and Ethan turned 18. The orphanage doors would soon close to him. Mr. Thompson handed him an envelope with some cash inside, his savings from years of work. "It ain't much," he said, "but it's a start. Now go find your way, kid." Ethan didn't know what to say. He stood there, holding the envelope, realizing that this was his only chance. With a heavy heart, he said goodbye to the only home he had ever known and walked into the unknown, carrying Mr. Thompson's lessons with him. As he left, Ethan promised himself two things. He wouldn't forget where he came from, but he also wouldn't let it define his future. He was determined to make something of himself, even if the road ahead seemed uncertain and daunting. Stepping out into the world for the first time felt like stepping into an ocean of uncertainty for Ethan. The city buzzed with life, but none of it seemed to belong to him. Every corner he turned, he saw people rushing, making deals, living the kind of life he had only imagined from behind orphanage walls. He found himself both overwhelmed and inspired by it all. His first few weeks were hard, jobs were scarce, and money was even scarcer. Ethan took whatever he could find, dishwashing, cleaning floors, anything that paid a few dollars. Every night, he collapsed onto a worn-out mattress in a rundown room, exhausted, and wondering if he'd made a mistake leaving the orphanage. The city wasn't kind, but Ethan held on to his dreams. Late at night, he'd stare at the ceiling, imagining a life where he was more than just another faceless worker. He wanted to rise above it, to prove to himself and to the world that he could be more than what his past had defined him to be. "You'll never make it," people would say, their words laced with doubt. But Ethan refused to listen. He carried with him the quiet determination Mr. Thompson had instilled in him. Even when he felt the weight of despair creeping in, he pushed forward, believing that his hard work would eventually pay off. One cold evening, after another long shift washing dishes, Ethan wandered past a luxurious restaurant. Inside, men in expensive suits laughed and drank, their lives seeming worlds away from his own. A spark ignited in him as he watched through the glass. He wanted that life, not for the luxury, but for the freedom it represented, the ability to live on his own terms. Ethan knew he needed to find a way to break out of the cycle he was trapped in. He couldn't keep doing menial jobs forever. But the question loomed over him: how? He had no education, no connections, and very little money. It was a desperate situation, but he wasn't ready to give up. Then one day, while cleaning tables at a small cafe, Ethan overheard two men talking about investments and the stock market. It was like they were speaking another language, but the idea of making money without lifting a finger intrigued him. For the first time, he saw a glimmer of hope, an opportunity that might just change everything. That night, Ethan stayed up late, reading whatever he could about the stock market at the public library. He didn't understand much at first, but he was determined to learn. This, he thought, could be his way out. He might not have a formal education, but he had something just as valuable: determination. The seed was planted. Ethan had a new goal: to learn everything he could about investing. It was his ticket to the life he had always dreamed of, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, he felt like he was moving towards something real, something that could change his life forever. Ethan spent months buried in books, learning about stocks, investments, and financial markets. Every free moment he had was spent in the library, poring over pages filled with unfamiliar terms and strategies. He taught himself the basics, slowly piecing together the knowledge that had once seemed so out of reach. The more he learned, the more determined he became. His opportunity came in the form of a meager paycheck he had saved from his dishwashing job. It wasn't much, just enough to cover his rent and basic needs, but he set aside a small portion for an investment. It was risky, and Ethan knew it. He was gambling his future on something he barely understood, but he had no other choice. "Are you sure about this?" his co-worker Ryan asked as they walked home one evening. Ryan was the closest thing Ethan had to a friend in the city, but even he doubted Ethan's plan. "You could lose everything." Ethan shrugged, feeling the weight of the decision. "I don't have much to lose anyway," he replied. With trembling hands, Ethan made his first investment. It was a small, almost insignificant amount compared to the big players in the market, but to him, it was everything. He watched the numbers on the screen with bated breath, feeling his heart race every time they fluctuated. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan checked his investment obsessively. At first, nothing seemed to happen. His money barely moved, and doubts began to creep in. Had he made a mistake? Was this just another dead-end path? But something inside him refused to give up. He had come too far to turn back now. Then one morning, as he logged in to check his account, Ethan noticed a slight increase in his investment. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. It felt like a small victory in a long war, a sign that maybe, just maybe, he was on the right path. Encouraged by this small win, Ethan began to study more advanced strategies, trying to figure out how to maximize his earnings. He spent countless nights awake, his eyes glued to financial charts and market trends. The world of finance was starting to make sense to him, and he felt the rush of excitement every time he made a decision that paid off. But success didn't come without sacrifice. Ethan worked long hours at the cafe, barely scraping by, while pouring every spare dollar into his investments. He lived frugally, skipping meals and social events to focus on his goal. It was a lonely existence, but he believed that the sacrifice would be worth it in the end. The first opportunity had come, and Ethan had seized it. He knew it wouldn't be the last. He was no longer just the boy from the orphanage, destined to be forgotten. He was a man with a plan, and for the first time he could see the possibility of a future filled with something more than struggle. Despite Ethan's growing knowledge of the stock market, life wasn't getting any easier. By day, he was still a dishwasher, scrubbing away at the greasy plates in the back of a crowded restaurant. By night, he was an aspiring investor, poring over financial charts and praying for his big break. The contrast between his dreams and reality couldn't have been starker. One night, after a particularly grueling shift, Ethan sat with his co-worker Ryan outside the restaurant. "Man, how long do you think we'll be stuck doing this?" Ryan asked, lighting a cigarette. Ethan shrugged, staring at the distant lights of the city. "As long as it takes," he muttered, determination masking the exhaustion in his voice. The paychecks from his dishwashing job barely covered his rent, and there were days when Ethan had to skip meals just to make ends meet. He would tell himself it was temporary, that one day he'd be free of this grind. But in the quiet moments, when the noise of the kitchen had faded, doubt crept in. How long could he keep going like this? The daily struggles were wearing him down. Ethan worked long hours, often feeling invisible to the customers he served. They didn't see him as a person with dreams and ambitions. To them, he was just the guy clearing their plates. It was hard to keep faith when every day felt like a battle against the odds, but Ethan had one thing that kept him going, the vision of a life beyond this. Every morning, as he washed his hands in the back of the restaurant, he reminded himself that he wasn't working just to survive. He was working to build something greater than himself. "Why do you even bother?" Ryan asked one evening as they clocked out. "It's not like any of this is going to matter in the long run." Ethan turned to him, his eyes tired but fierce. "Because I have to believe it will," he said quietly. Ryan didn't respond, but the look on his face said he didn't understand. The grind of the working-class life was relentless, but Ethan refused to let it break him. He kept his head down, saving every penny he could and pouring it into his investments. He had learned early on that the only way out was through hard work, and he was willing to sacrifice everything for a shot at something better. As the months passed, the weight of his struggle seemed to grow heavier. Ethan watched as people came and went, finding new jobs or giving up on their dreams. But he remained steadfast, holding on to the belief that one day all the sacrifices would be worth it. Ethan's life was a constant push and pull between survival and ambition. The struggle of the working class was his present, but it wouldn't be his future. He had seen a glimpse of something more, and that vision was the only thing keeping him from collapsing under the weight of it all. One evening, while cleaning tables after a long shift, Ethan overheard a conversation that would change the course of his life. Two businessmen were talking about a recent stock market surge, throwing around terms Ethan had spent months studying. Their casual talk about money made it seem so effortless, so attainable. It sparked something deep within him, a hunger for more. As he cleared their plates, he listened closely. "It's all about timing," one of the men said, not even noticing Ethan's presence. "If you know when to buy, you'll always come out on top." Those words stuck with him. Timing. That was the key. Later that night, Ethan couldn't sleep. His mind was buzzing with the conversation he had overheard. What if he was missing out on something big simply because he wasn't taking enough risks? He had been playing it safe, but maybe that was holding him back. He realized he needed to be bolder, to seize the opportunities that came his way without hesitation. The next day, Ethan pored over stock charts, searching for patterns, trends, anything that would give him an edge. He was no longer content to let opportunities slip by. He was ready to dive in, even if it meant risking everything. The fire in his heart had been ignited, and there was no turning back now. "Are you sure about this?" Ryan asked when Ethan told him about his plan to invest more aggressively. "I mean, you barely have enough to get by as it is." Ethan smiled, a new confidence shining in his eyes. "If I don't take the leap now, when will I?" Ryan shook his head, but couldn't argue with Ethan's resolve. Ethan's ambition began to consume him. Every spare moment was spent researching, studying, and making small but bold moves in the market. He wasn't just chasing wealth. He was chasing the freedom that came with it. He wanted control over his life, and he knew that meant taking bigger risks. There were moments of doubt, of course. Nights when the numbers didn't add up, when his investments seemed to be sinking instead of growing. But each time, Ethan pushed through the fear, reminding himself of Mr. Thompson's words. "Hard work and perseverance, that's the way." Weeks turned into months, and Ethan's efforts began to show signs of promise. His small investments were starting to pay off, and for the first time, he felt like he had a real chance. It wasn't about getting rich quickly, it was about building something that could last, something that could finally lift him out of the life he had always known. The spark of ambition had turned into a full-blown flame. Ethan was no longer content to scrape by. He was determined to make his mark, to rise above the struggles of his past. And as he watched the numbers on the screen slowly climb, he knew he was closer than ever to achieving his dream. Ethan sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the laptop screen. His heart raced as he prepared to make his biggest investment yet. It wasn't a huge amount compared to the seasoned investors, but to him, it was everything. He was about to risk almost all his savings on a single stock, a risky move, but one he believed could be his breakthrough. His finger hovered over the mouse. He took a deep breath, hearing Mr. Thompson's voice in his mind. "Sometimes you have to bet on yourself, kid." With a quick motion, he clicked the button. The deal was done. His fate, now tied to the volatile market, was out of his hands. Ethan felt a mix of excitement and terror. He had never taken a gamble this big before, and the stakes were high. If this went wrong, he would be back to square one. Or worse. But something inside him told him this was the right move. He had done his research. Now, it was time to see if it would pay off. Days turned into a blur of checking the stock market, his eyes glued to the screen every chance he got. At work, he'd steal moments to check his phone, hoping for good news. "Any luck yet?" Ryan would ask. Ethan would just shake his head, the tension building with each passing day. One evening, after an exhausting shift, Ethan checked his account. His heart dropped. The stock had taken a hit, and his savings had plummeted. Panic set in. He had risked everything, and now it seemed like he was losing it all. For the first time, doubt crept in. Had he been too reckless? Was he destined to fail? He sat in the dark, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of his decision crushing him. He thought about giving up, about pulling out whatever was left and walking away from his dreams. But deep down, something stopped him. Ethan remembered all the nights spent learning, all the sacrifices he had made. He couldn't give up now, not when he had come so far. The next morning, Ethan woke up to a miracle. The stock had rebounded overnight, surging higher than he had ever expected. His small investment had doubled. He could hardly believe it. For a moment he sat there, stunned, before a slow smile crept across his face. He had taken a risk, and it had paid off. "I did it," he whispered to himself, still in shock. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he was in control of his destiny. This was only the beginning, but it was proof that his dreams weren't impossible. The path ahead was still uncertain, but now he knew one thing for sure: he had the courage to keep moving forward. The thrill of success was intoxicating, but Ethan stayed grounded. He knew the market could change at any moment. Still, this first win fueled his ambition. He wasn't just chasing money anymore, he was chasing the life he had always dreamed of, the life that seemed so far away when he was just a boy in the orphanage. Just when things seemed to be going in Ethan's favor, the unexpected happened. A sudden crash in the market sent his investments spiraling downward. He had watched his savings grow over the past few months, only to see them vanish overnight. The shock hit him like a punch to the gut. Everything he had worked for, gone in an instant. He sat in front of his laptop, frozen in disbelief. His heart raced as he refreshed the page, hoping it was some kind of glitch. But the numbers didn't lie. The market had taken a sharp dive, and Ethan's account was bleeding money. "This can't be happening," he muttered under his breath. The following days were a nightmare. Ethan avoided checking his account, knowing that the situation was getting worse by the hour. His once bold spirit had been crushed under the weight of this failure. All the late nights, all the risks, it felt like they had been for nothing. At work, Ryan noticed the change in him. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan forced a smile, but inside he was unraveling. "Just a lot on my mind," he replied, trying to hide the growing panic. The truth was, Ethan didn't know how to face this loss. He had always believed that hard work and determination would pull him through, but this was different. This was out of his control. He couldn't fix it with more effort or more research. It was a harsh reminder that the world of finance was ruthless, and sometimes even the best-laid plans could fall apart. One night, as he sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of the failure finally hit him. Tears welled up in his eyes. He felt like he had let everyone down, Mr. Thompson, Ryan, and most of all, himself. He had promised that he wouldn't let his past define him, but now it felt like he was right back where he started. In the midst of his despair, Ethan received a call from Mr. Thompson. "How are you holding up, kid?" the old man asked. Ethan hesitated, but finally admitted the truth. "I lost everything. I don't know what to do." There was a long pause before Mr. Thompson replied, "You haven't lost everything. Not yet. You still have your spirit, and that's worth more than any dollar in the bank." Those words stuck with Ethan. He realized that while he had lost money, he hadn't lost the lessons he'd learned or the strength he had built over the years. The journey wasn't over. It was just another obstacle. And if there was one thing Ethan knew how to do, it was survive. The crushing blow had knocked him down, but Ethan wasn't ready to stay down. Slowly, he began to rebuild, not just his finances, but his resolve. He would learn from this failure, and he would come back stronger. It wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Ethan spent weeks grappling with the loss, but something inside him refused to let go. The failure had stung deeply, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had reignited a fire within him, a determination to rise again. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was no stranger to struggle. He had faced worse and survived. Late one night, Ethan sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the empty notebook in front of him. It was time to start over. He began jotting down ideas, strategies, and lessons learned from his failure. He realized that his mistake hadn't been taking risks, it had been not preparing for the worst. "I'm going to do things differently this time," he whispered to himself. He couldn't afford another reckless gamble. He needed to be smarter, more calculated. The market had taught him a brutal lesson, but he was determined to come back wiser. This time, he'd be ready for whatever came his way. Ryan noticed the shift in Ethan's attitude. "You seem different," he commented one evening after work. Ethan smiled, a quiet confidence replacing the defeat that had once clouded his expression. "I'm not giving up. I've got too much to prove." Ryan nodded, seeing the resolve in his friend's eyes. Ethan began working even harder, both at the restaurant and on his investments. He started small, making cautious moves in the market, studying every trend, every pattern. His past failure had taught him patience, and now he approached every decision with a level head. He knew he couldn't afford to be impulsive. As the months passed, Ethan's discipline started to pay off. Slowly but surely, his investments began to grow again. It wasn't the rapid rise he had experienced before, but it was steady, and that gave him hope. He was learning to play the long game, to trust the process rather than chase quick wins. One evening, Ethan received a call from an investment broker he had met during his research. The broker offered him a chance to attend a private seminar for up-and-coming investors. It was an opportunity Ethan had never expected, but one that could open doors for him. He hesitated for only a moment before accepting the invitation. The seminar was a turning point. Surrounded by successful investors, Ethan felt out of place at first, but as he listened to their stories, he realized they had all faced setbacks, just like him. Failure, he learned, was not the end. It was a stepping stone. He walked away from the seminar with new connections and a renewed sense of purpose. Ethan's rise wasn't swift, but it was sure. He was no longer chasing the highs and lows of the market. Instead, he was building something stable, something real. He hadn't just recovered from his failure, he had risen from the ashes, stronger than ever before. The boy from the orphanage was gone. In his place stood a man determined to succeed, no matter what it took. Months after Ethan had rebuilt his confidence and strategy, a sudden opportunity came his way, one that he never saw coming. One of his small investments, something he'd almost forgotten about, skyrocketed overnight. It was a company that had been flying under the radar, and now it was making waves in the tech industry. Ethan couldn't believe his eyes when he saw the numbers. Sitting at his kitchen table, staring at the surge in his account, he felt a mix of shock and disbelief. "This can't be real," he muttered, refreshing the page over and over again. But the numbers didn't change. His modest investment had multiplied several times over, transforming into a substantial sum. He picked up the phone and called Ryan, his voice shaking with excitement. "Ryan, you won't believe this. I hit it big." Ryan, always skeptical, asked, "How big?" Ethan hesitated before responding, "Big enough that I don't have to wash dishes anymore." The silence on the other end of the line said it all. Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of relief and triumph. For years he had struggled, clawing his way out of poverty with little more than determination and grit. Now it seemed like all his hard work was finally paying off. He wasn't rich yet, but he had enough to move forward with his life in ways he had only dreamed of. But with success came a new kind of pressure. Ethan knew this was just the beginning. He couldn't let his guard down. This was his chance to truly change his life, and he couldn't afford to squander it. The breakthrough had been unforeseen, but now that it had arrived, he was determined to handle it wisely. Ryan met him later that night at their usual spot outside the restaurant. "So, what's next?" Ryan asked, taking a drag from his cigarette. Ethan smiled, feeling more confident than he had in years. "I'm going to build something bigger. This is just the start." Ethan's newfound success didn't change him, at least not in the way some might expect. Instead of splurging on luxuries, he invested in his education. He enrolled in online courses to deepen his understanding of finance and business. He knew that if he wanted to sustain this success, he needed to be as sharp as possible. The excitement of the breakthrough slowly gave way to focused determination. Ethan spent his days working, learning, and planning. He didn't want to be a flash in the pan. He wanted to build something lasting, something that would carry him through life. The stakes had never been higher. Ethan's breakthrough had given him the financial freedom he had longed for, but it had also taught him that success wasn't just about money. It was about discipline, perseverance, and the ability to seize opportunities when they came. He wasn't the same person who had struggled in the orphanage. He was someone who had fought for every inch of his success, and now he was ready for the next step. With his first big win under his belt, Ethan's confidence soared. But he knew that this was just the start of his climb. Every day, he reminded himself that success wasn't a one-time event. It was something he had to build piece by piece. He began to diversify his investments, carefully choosing companies he believed had long-term potential. It wasn't just about quick gains anymore. It was about creating a future. Ethan's life slowly began to change. The small apartment he'd once called home now felt too cramped. With his newfound financial security, he upgraded to a modest but comfortable place. He allowed himself a few luxuries, but nothing extravagant. He was still cautious, knowing that one wrong move could take it all away. Ryan noticed the shift in Ethan's life and couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and envy. "You're really doing it, man," Ryan said one evening as they sat together, reminiscing about their early days at the restaurant. "I always knew you had something in you, but this is big." Ethan smiled, grateful for the support. "It's not over yet, Ryan. I've still got a long way to go." As Ethan's wealth grew, so did his network. He was invited to business dinners and networking events, rubbing shoulders with people he had once only dreamed of meeting. Yet despite the glitz and glamour, Ethan remained grounded. He never forgot where he came from. The struggles of his past were etched into his soul, driving him to stay humble and focused. One night, at a high-profile event, Ethan met Victoria, a savvy investor who had heard about his rise from nothing. "I've been following your story," she said, a gleam of interest in her eyes. "It's rare to see someone with your background make it this far. What's your secret?" Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "No secret, just hard work and a little luck." Victoria smiled. "Well, you've got something special. Keep it up and you'll go far." The words lingered in Ethan's mind long after the event had ended. He realized that while he had achieved a level of success, there was still so much more to learn, so much more he could accomplish. The climb wasn't without challenges. The market was unpredictable, and Ethan faced setbacks along the way. But each time he adapted, learning from his mistakes and coming back stronger. His determination was unshakable. He wasn't just chasing wealth, he was chasing the life he had always dreamed of, a life where he had control over his destiny. Ethan's climb to success was a slow and steady one, built on a foundation of resilience and patience. He no longer feared failure. In fact, he embraced it as part of the journey. Every loss was a lesson, every setback an opportunity to grow. He was no longer just surviving, he was thriving. As he looked back on his journey, Ethan felt a sense of pride. He had come from nothing, but he had built something extraordinary. The boy who had once stared out of an orphanage window, longing for a better life, had finally found his place in the world. But this was only the beginning. Ethan knew there was still so much more to achieve, and he was ready for whatever came next. As Ethan's success grew, so did the demands on his time and energy. His life had transformed from scraping by to managing investments and attending high-stakes meetings. But with this success came a cost, one he hadn't anticipated. The late nights, the endless research, and the pressure to stay ahead left little room for anything else. Slowly, Ethan began to realize that he was losing touch with the simple joys of life. One evening, as he sat alone in his upscale apartment, he thought about the people he had once shared his struggles with, especially Ryan. They had drifted apart in recent months. Ryan still worked at the restaurant, and their lives seemed worlds apart now. Ethan missed the camaraderie they once had, but he didn't know how to bridge the growing gap between them. Ethan's schedule became relentless. He barely had time to eat, let alone see friends. He had achieved what he had always wanted, financial freedom, but it came at the expense of his personal life. He often found himself feeling isolated, surrounded by people at business meetings, but emotionally alone. The success he had longed for was beginning to feel like a double-edged sword. Victoria, whom Ethan had grown close to, noticed the change in him. "You're doing great, Ethan, but don't lose yourself in all this," she said over dinner one night. "You've worked so hard to get here, but you need to find balance." Ethan nodded, but inside, he didn't know how to slow down. He was afraid that if he stopped, everything would fall apart. The pressure to maintain his success weighed heavily on him. Every decision felt critical, every investment a potential risk. He began to feel like he was constantly running, never able to stop and appreciate how far he had come. The joy of his early wins was fading, replaced by the stress of sustaining his newfound lifestyle. Ryan reached out one day, inviting Ethan to catch up at their old spot outside the restaurant. "It's been a while," Ryan said when they met, a hint of sadness in his voice. Ethan felt a pang of guilt as he realized how distant he had become. "Yeah, I've been busy," Ethan replied, though he knew that wasn't the whole truth. As they sat together, Ethan realized how much he had missed these simple moments. Success had given him material wealth, but it had also taken away the connection he once had with the people who mattered. For the first time, Ethan wondered if he had lost sight of what was truly important. That night, as Ethan walked home, he reflected on the sacrifices he had made. Yes, he had achieved financial success, but at what cost? His relationships, his peace of mind, his happiness, all seemed to be slipping away. The personal sacrifices were starting to outweigh the rewards, and Ethan knew something had to change. Ethan made a promise to himself that night. He wouldn't let his success define him or rob him of the things that truly mattered. It was time to find balance, to reconnect with the people and the parts of life that brought him joy. He realized that true wealth wasn't just about money. It was about living a life that was full, meaningful, and shared with the people he loved. After his conversation with Ryan, Ethan knew he had to make changes. Success had given him wealth, but had also distanced him from the values he had grown up with. He decided it was time to reconnect with the person he was before the money, someone who valued hard work, loyalty, and relationships. He needed to return to humility. One quiet morning, Ethan found himself walking back to the old neighborhood where the orphanage stood. It was still there, unchanged by time, even though his life had transformed drastically. The memories came flooding back, his lonely days, the wisdom of Mr. Thompson, and the small boy who once dreamed of escaping this place. Ethan walked through the gates of the orphanage, greeted by the familiar sounds of children playing. He spotted Mrs. Hall, the kind woman who had worked there for years. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Ethan, is that you?" she asked, her voice full of surprise. He smiled. "Yeah, it's me." They sat together in the small office, talking about old times. "You've come a long way," Mrs. Hall said, pride evident in her eyes. Ethan nodded but felt a twinge of guilt. "I have, but I've forgotten some important things along the way," he admitted. "I wanted to come back here, to remember who I am." Mrs. Hall smiled gently. "You've always known who you are, Ethan. You just needed to be reminded." Her words struck him deeply. In the pursuit of success, he had forgotten the lessons of his past, the value of humility, kindness, and giving back. He realized that the boy who had grown up in this orphanage still lived within him. As he walked through the halls, Ethan saw the children who now lived there. They reminded him of himself, filled with hope, but also longing for a better life. In that moment, Ethan knew he had to do something more than just reflect. He needed to give back, to use his success to help those who were once in his shoes. Ethan made a decision. He would quietly donate to the orphanage, funding programs that would give these children the opportunities he had once dreamed of. But he didn't want recognition or praise. This wasn't about proving something to the world. It was about staying true to the values that had shaped him. Later that day, as he left the orphanage, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The visit had grounded him, reminding him of the simple truths he had almost forgotten. Wealth wasn't just about financial gain, it was about using what you had to make a difference in the lives of others. That evening, Ethan sat down and wrote a letter to Mr. Thompson, the man who had been his first mentor. In it, he thanked him for the lessons that had carried him through life. "You told me not to forget where I came from," he wrote. "I almost did, but now I know better." He mailed the letter, feeling lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The return to humility didn't just change Ethan's perspective, it changed his heart. He realized that true success was measured not by what he had gained, but by what he could give, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. Not just as a businessman, but as a person. A few weeks after his visit to the orphanage, Ethan received a letter that he hadn't expected. It was from Mr. Thompson, the janitor who had been his mentor so many years ago. The letter was short, but filled with warmth. "I knew you'd make it, kid. Come visit an old man sometime." Those words stirred something deep in Ethan. It had been years since he'd seen Mr. Thompson, and it was time to reconnect. Ethan made the trip to the small town where Mr. Thompson now lived. The town was quiet, a stark contrast to the busy city Ethan had grown accustomed to. When he arrived at the modest house, he saw the familiar figure of Mr. Thompson sitting on the porch, looking out at the world with the same calm wisdom Ethan remembered. "Well, if it isn't the big shot, Mr. Thompson teased as Ethan approached. Ethan laughed, feeling a wave of nostalgia. "I wouldn't be here without you," he said, shaking the old man's hand. They sat together, the years between them melting away as they talked about life, the orphanage, and everything in between. "I've kept up with your story," Mr. Thompson said, his eyes twinkling. "You've done well for yourself, Ethan, but tell me, are you happy?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He had achieved everything he had once dreamed of, but happiness? That was harder to answer. "I think I'm getting there," Ethan admitted, feeling a weight lift as he spoke the truth. Mr. Thompson smiled knowingly. "Happiness isn't in the money, you know that. It's in the moments, the people you keep close, and what you give back." Ethan nodded, understanding now more than ever what his mentor had always tried to teach him. He realized that while he had been chasing success, he had almost lost sight of the simple joys that made life meaningful. They spent the afternoon talking, just like old times. Mr. Thompson shared stories of his life after the orphanage, and Ethan filled him in on the highs and lows of his journey. There was an ease between them, the kind that comes with deep respect and understanding. Ethan felt like he had come full circle. Before he left, Mr. Thompson gave Ethan a piece of advice that would stay with him forever. You've done good, but don't forget, no matter how far you go, always keep your feet on the ground. It was a simple reminder of humility, one that Ethan vowed never to forget. Success wasn't just about rising above, it was about staying connected to where you started. As Ethan drove away from the small town, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Seeing Mr. Thompson again had reminded him of who he truly was and the values that had shaped his life. He had made it in the world, but that didn't mean he was better than anyone else. In fact, it was the people who had supported him along the way that mattered most. That night, Ethan sat in his apartment thinking about the future. He had achieved financial success, but now he wanted something more. He wanted to build a legacy, not just of wealth, but of kindness, generosity, and connection. His reunion with Mr. Thompson had shown him that true wealth wasn't just measured in dollars, it was measured in the impact you had on others. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He would mentor young people, just as Mr. Thompson had mentored him. He wanted to give back, to guide those who came from nothing, just like he did. It was time to pay it forward, to be the kind of mentor who could change lives, one conversation at a time. Ethan's decision to mentor young people marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. He started small, reaching out to local community centers and schools, offering to speak with kids who were struggling. He shared his story, not to boast about his success, but to show them that no matter where you start, it's possible to change your life. One afternoon, he met a young boy named Marcus at a youth center. Marcus reminded Ethan of himself, a quiet, observant kid who didn't quite fit in. "So what do you want to do when you grow up?" Ethan asked, sitting across from him. Marcus shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "I don't know, maybe nothing. People like me don't get far." Ethan felt a familiar pang in his chest. He saw so much of his younger self in Marcus. The doubt, the fear, the belief that the world was too big, too hard. "You know," Ethan began, "I used to feel the same way. I grew up in an orphanage. People didn't expect much from me either. But the thing is, you get to decide what happens next. No one else." Marcus looked up, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What did you do?" he asked. Ethan smiled. "I worked hard. I failed. I got back up. And most importantly, I didn't let anyone tell me what I was worth. You can do the same." The conversation was brief, but Ethan could see a change in Marcus, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. As Ethan continued mentoring, he found himself more fulfilled than he had ever been. The joy of helping others far outweighed the thrill of any financial gain. He realized that his success had given him the platform to make a real difference, to lift others up in ways that went beyond money. Ethan's reputation as a mentor grew, and soon he was asked to speak at events and schools across the city. He was no longer just known as the man who had made his fortune. He was known as someone who gave back. His legacy was becoming one of compassion, empathy, and the belief that anyone could rise above their circumstances. One evening, as he sat in his apartment reflecting on how far he had come, Ethan received a letter from Marcus. In it, Marcus thanked him for the advice and told him he had decided to pursue his dream of becoming an engineer. "You were right," Marcus wrote. "I get to decide what happens next." Ethan smiled, his heart full. This was the true measure of success, seeing others succeed because of the seeds he had planted. The boy who had once stared out of the orphanage window, longing for a better life, had not only achieved his dreams, but had also helped others realize theirs. Ethan's story had come full circle. He had gone from being an orphan with nothing to a millionaire with everything, but it was the impact he made on others that truly defined his legacy. As Ethan looked toward the future, he knew his work wasn't done. There were still more people to help, more lives to touch, but for the first time in a long while, he felt complete. He had found his purpose, not in wealth, but in giving back. And in doing so, he had built a legacy that would last far beyond any fortune. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling at peace with the journey he had traveled. His story, once filled with struggle and loss, had transformed into one of hope, resilience, and most of all, connection. And that, he realized, was worth more than all the money in the world.